Republicans continually promise tax cuts for the wealthy while ignoring the inevitable consequences. Today, Michael Bennett had enough, exposing the uncomfortable truth Washington has been avoiding for years.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for coming in today, and thanks for having this hearing. Secretary Bessent, the last time you were here, I asked you about your emphasis on domestic discretionary funding in your opening statement. You had stated, quote, "We must adjust federal domestic discretionary spending to get our fiscal house in order while striking an urgent tone on our growing deficit." I mentioned to you then that domestic discretionary spending is only 15% of our budget. And I think if you were serious about deficit reduction, you might not push for tax cuts that almost certainly could not be offset by discretionary adjustments alone. And now, of course, we know you can't. Today, we actually have the details of your plan. Take health care from 10 million Americans, 126,000 Coloradans. Cut nutrition assistance for millions of adults. Sunset clean energy investments that are so critical to the American West. Give over 40% of the tax benefits of this bill to the top 5%. And it's not even close to being paid for. Even my colleagues on the Republican side, who for years and years and years have claimed to be the fiscally responsible party, now are admitting that it's not paid for. This bill adds another $2.4 trillion to our national debt. It will push the deficit to GDP ratio up to 7%, which you said when you were here before was unsustainable, far from the 3% target that you described. If you look at your proposals taken together, there is no getting around the fact. There is no getting around the fact that the richest Americans receive an average tax cut of $300,000, which again, we're not paying for with the discretionary cuts that you advertise. So once again, we will have to borrow money in order to assist the people in this country who least need a tax cut at this moment, while the Americans who have been made miserable by the economy that they're in actually see income reduced because of cuts to Medicaid and cuts to SNAP. Meanwhile, and I think, Mr. Chairman, this is really important, meanwhile, interest rates are at 20-year highs. Moody's has slashed our credit rating because of the fiscal irresponsibility of this administration. The World Bank has cut our growth estimates in half, and the bond markets are screaming at us to stop. We now pay, and we are paying this year, more in interest than we are in the national defense. Secretary Bessent, how can you square your concern with fiscal health with deficit finance growth for families that need those tax cuts least?
Senator, I'll begin with that we did not get here. We inherited this fiscal situation that I believe.
Well, you inherited from Donald Trump, who was here. You did, Mr. Bessent.
No,
yes,
sir.
you did, Mr. Bessent. You inherited from Donald Trump. He's the first president to come back after a 4-year hiatus, after we know exactly what the last tax cuts did, which was blow a massive hole in our deficit and debt. You can't sit here and lie about that. It's true. The data, to coin a phrase, the data shows that that's the result. The math shows that that is the result. No one on this side of the aisle admits anymore that or claims anymore that they didn't blow a huge hole in the deficit. They did. And now you're here saying to the American people, let's double down on that. We're going to give tax cuts for the wealthy. We are going to give tax cuts again to the wealthiest people in America, and we are going to finance it on the backs of the sons and daughters of teachers and firefighters and police officers all over this country because we can't pay for it. Because the Treasury Secretary discovered somehow that domestic discretionary spending is only 15% of the budget, and therefore you can't balance it there.
Well, sir, we had a referendum on November 5th.
You certainly did. I agree with
policies. Your side lost.
I agree with that.
And a higher decibel
And
level.
I'm a rare Democrat who doesn't blame Donald Trump for winning. I'm sad he won. I don't blame him for winning. But don't come here.
In your statements,
go ahead.
They have veracity.
Go ahead, Mr. Secretary. What?
Higher decibel level does not give your statements more veracity.
My statements are true, if that's the word, if that's what you mean by veracity. My statements are true. You blew a massive hole in the deficit when your predecessor was sitting here under Donald Trump. And so the question is, can't we think of something better to do with the money than this debt, than drive up interest rates by borrowing money from our kids so the richest people in America can get a tax cut when they don't need it? That is the reality of your plan.
Well, sir, actually the high interest rates were achieved during the Biden administration in October of 2023, and we have not touched those rates since then. So
the higher interest rates.
No, your statement's incorrect.
I'm out of time, and I appreciate the indulgence of the chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
What makes the exchange between Senator Michael Bennett and Scott Bessent so significant isn't just the passion or volume. It's the deeper truth Bennett is trying to drag out into the open, something Washington has been avoiding for years. Bennett's sharp words, "You can't sit here and lie," aren't just aimed at Bessent's talking points. They're a direct challenge to a much larger political narrative that has been dominating the national conversation. Bennett is questioning the decades-long conditioning that has convinced so many that tax cuts for the wealthiest American, followed by cuts to vital programs for working families, will somehow work out in the end. It's a trap, and Bennett is finally exposing it. The core of Bennett's frustration is with the well-worn lie that Republicans tell every time they propose large tax cuts for the wealthy. They sell it as a solution that will pay for itself. They claim that these cuts will spur growth, unleash investment, and ultimately help working families. But we've seen this pattern time and again. When the dust settles, the consequences are the same. The tax cuts never pay for themselves. The cost explodes. The deficit balloons. And then, predictably, the same politicians who swore they were champions of fiscal responsibility turn around and demand cuts to Medicaid, food assistance, education funding, and clean energy investment, the very programs that stabilize communities and provide a lifeline to millions of families. Bennett is pushing back against the quiet part of the GOP's strategy, the part they don't want to talk about. What Bessent and others are proposing isn't just a shift in budget priorities. It's a shift in national identity. Cutting Medicaid isn't just about balancing the budget. It's about 10 million people losing health care. It's about families wondering if they'll survive a medical emergency. Cutting food assistance means parents are forced to choose between putting gas in their car or putting food on the table. And ending clean energy programs in the middle of climate-driven wildfires and droughts isn't about making tough choices. It's about negligence. Bennett is also calling out the moral mismatch embedded in these numbers. The reality is that nearly half of the benefits from these tax cuts go to the top 5% of earners, people who are already insulated from the pressures of inflation, rising healthcare costs, and housing crises. Meanwhile, teachers and firefighters, the very people who are keeping our communities functioning, are told that the country simply can't afford their health care. This is the contradiction Bennett is responding to. It's not just an economic issue, it's a moral one. What adds urgency to this conversation is the global context that often gets overlooked. Interest rates are at 20-year highs, and investors are starting to signal that the country's creditworthiness is weakening due to reckless fiscal decisions. The recent downgrade from Moody's and the World Bank's reduced growth forecast aren't just political statements, they're financial alarms. These are the kinds of warnings countries typically hear when they're ignoring the long-term risks of distorting budgets or pretending the consequences don't exist. Bennett's point is simple, yet critical. The debt isn't abstract anymore. The cost of borrowing has become one of the largest line items in the federal budget, bigger than national defense. This should be a wake-up call for policymakers. Instead of doubling down on the same failed policies that got us into this situation, they should be taking these warnings seriously. Instead of pushing for more tax cuts that primarily benefit the wealthy, they should be focusing on solutions that address the root causes of the deficit and the rising national debt. What makes this hearing something so revealing is that Bennett refuses to let Bessent reframe history. When Bessent tries to claim that they inherited this financial mess, Bennett is quick to remind him who they inherited it from. It wasn't the Democrats. It was the Republican-controlled government of Donald Trump. The very tax cuts that are still driving the deficit today were passed under Trump's administration. This isn't partisan speculation. It's documented economic impact. Bennett isn't defending the Democrats. He's defending reality. And that's something we don't often see in Washington. These hearings are not just argumentative theater. They are rare moments when the true consequences of policy become visible. Bennett is doing something that's all too rare in politics. He's refusing to let misleading narratives go unchallenged. He's refusing to pretend that the needs of working families should be sacrificed so that the wealthy can keep benefiting from a system rigged in their favor. He's forcing the public to confront the consequences of these policies, not just debate the effects. If you want a political system that's honest about trade-offs, about who wins and who loses from these decisions, then moments like this matter. They deserve attention, discussion, and accountability. Because budgets aren't just spreadsheets, they're moral documents. They reveal who a government values and who it's willing to leave behind. And if we're going to have a serious discussion about our nation's future, we can't afford to ignore that. Bennett's challenge to Bessent isn't just about holding one person accountable, it's about forcing a broader conversation about our national priority. It's about recognizing that every decision made in Washington has real-world consequences for millions of Americans. And if we don't start facing those consequences head-on, we risk continuing down a path where only the wealthy and well-connected benefit, while the rest of the country is left to pay the price. So, if you want more breakdowns that don't just rehash the headlines, but actually connect the dots and make the stakes clear, make sure you're subscribed. Stick with us. Because understanding the why is just as important as understanding the what. The stakes couldn't be higher, and it's time we start having the honest conversation we've been avoiding for years.